There is an old story of a military time of a U.S. submarine that was involved in an accident and it sank. In 1927, the USS 109, S-class submarine from the United States Navy, sank to the bottom of the ocean, and with it, many men perished. But there were 6 who survived at least for a time. And as rescue efforts were underway, divers sought to try to free these men from their watery grave. And as they were diving down and drawing close to the submarine, they began to hear noises, and all of the men ceased their work and silenced the surroundings as much as they could. And in the silence, then they heard a noise. At first it was a faint noise until they drew closer to the hull of the sub. And as they listened closely, they could tell that it was tapping. Tapping on the inside of that metal hull. And as they listened, they discovered that it was Morse codes. And as they interpreted the Morse codes, they discovered that from within the hull of that sub, the question was asked, is there hope? Is there hope? Over and over again. To which the rescuers then began to tap their reply from the outsides, tapping back into the men. There is always hope. Is there hope? There is always hope. Indeed, that is a message even for our time. There is always hope. It is my suspicion that that's exactly the lesson that Jesus sought to teach his disciples when he gathered them 2 by 2 that Becky spoke of and that we read in the gospel today, and sent them out. You see, he sent them out taking nothing for their journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic, no change of clothes, no suitcase, no planning, just go. The question that was asked of the children is asked of us as well. Would we be willing to go? I in fact, like that kind of traveling. Just get up and go. Becky, more like her father, needs 48 hours to be spontaneous. We are called by Christ to go and to trust, to not go with the preparations and the plans of our own will and way and motivation and intention, but instead to go. And when he sent the disciples out, they were young. They were still plebes, if you will, in their discipleship, young in their journey with Jesus. They'd not walked with him long, not learned many lessons, not discovered his healing powers to the extent that they would soon. And Jesus, in the early moments of their ministry together, sent them out 2 by 2 to trust God. Don't take anything. None of your own planning and packing and preparations, but instead persevering through the struggles that you will indeed face, and being dependent upon each other and upon others, and most of all upon God to provide for your way. To trust and to have hope that God will provide. That's the word. And if you will, that's the word that I get as well from the movie Shawshank Redemption. It is a story of hope. As I mentioned, Andy Dufresne meets Ellis Redding. Ellis has been in prison already for 2 decades plus when Andy is sentenced to his 2 life sentences. And early on in the film, there's this scene where Andy is walking around the yard outside, and Red notices him. And he says this about Andy: I can see why some of the boys in prison look upon him as being snobby. He has a way about him, a walk and a talk that wasn't normal around here, that is, in prison. He strolls like a man in a park without a care or a worry in the world, like he had an invisible coat that would shield him from this place. It'd be fair to say that I liked Andy right from the start. And I did too. I liked the character of Andy, played by Tim Robbins. And the reason for that, I think at least in part, is for that spirit. That even when he finds himself incarcerated, a place full of no hope of ever getting out, 2 life sentences, he nonetheless walks about, as Red describes it, as he has an invisible coat protecting him from that hopelessness. He walks about as though he has no care in the world, that life is still good. And you've got to ask yourself, how? There's another scene later in the movie where Andy has an opportunity to strike up a deal with some of the prison guards. They're up on the roof of one of the buildings and they're tarring the roof, he and several of the other inmates. And he strikes a deal with the head prison guard that he'll help do his taxes and help him, quote unquote, save a little money, if you know what I mean. And the prison guard is about to throw him off the edge of the building for approaching him and even talking to him. And as Andy convinces him to let him try to help him shelter this tax money that he has, he works out the deal. He does the paperwork as a former banker, and he only asks for one thing, and that is for a few suds for his fellow workers when they finish the tarring of the roof. And so they meet, they make the agreement. He accomplishes the work, and there's another scene where they're sitting on that roof, and those prisoners, after tarring it in the heat of the summer sun, sit in the shade and sip on the cold suds. And this is what Red says about it. And that's how it came to pass. The convict crew that tarred the plate factory roof in the spring of '49, how we sat and drank with the sun on our shoulders and felt like free men. We were the lords of all creation. And I love how that's a further example of Andy's attitude. That attitude that seemed like a coat that he wore, protecting him from hopelessness. And not only that, he then began to share that gift with others. He allowed those men, those other prisoners that sat on that roof with him, experience what it was like that even in the midst of incarceration, even while they were surrounded by the hopeless thought that they would never get out, just for a moment, they sat and the sun shone down on them and they felt like free men. And the joy of that moment was given by Andy. It takes something special, and it is my belief that it is hope. And that's what Andy speaks about as he's sitting at the lunch table in the cafeteria with Red and other prisoners. He talks about this hope, and Red looks at him sternly across the table and says, "Hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can drive a man insane. It's of no use on the inside," Red says to Andy, "and you better get used to that idea." To which Andy replies, like Brooks did. Brooks is a man who was also a part of their inner circle, an older man who had been in prison for decades and was finally paroled and released. And upon his release, he found it very difficult, so difficult to live on the outside that he couldn't take it. He thought about trying to find a way to rob the store that he was working in so they'd send him back to prison because he wanted to be there. But instead, he does the most desperate of things and takes his own life. And Andy says, like Brooks, who had no hope. You see, Andy helps me remember as I watch that movie, and if you watch it or have, you know the message is this. Andy says it comes down to 2 things in life. 2 things only, and that is that you either get busy living or you get busy dying. And we have really only those 2. And I think that that's, again, what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples in that moment when he sent them out 2 by 2, taking nothing that they could rely on in themselves, but instead to trust God. See, much like Brooks, sometimes we who are Christ followers, who are in the church, we get like that institutionalization that happens for so many. Red spoke of it about Brooks when he said that happens, that he was institutionalized, if you will. He says it's funny how these walls, at first, when you're imprisoned, you begin to hate them. But then after a while, when you live there, you get used to them. But then if enough time passes, you become so dependent upon them that you cannot live without them. He said they send you here for life in prison, and that's exactly what it takes, your life. You see, we in the church sometimes we get like that as well. Rather than engaging the world like Jesus taught us to go out and to be in the world but not of it. Instead, we sometimes retreat from the world and we huddle around together and we protect ourselves from that and we build those walls of protection and we rely on our own ability and our own capacity and our own resources. But Jesus says, no, don't worry about any of that. No bag, no food, no money. No staff, nothing extra, just go. We're called as the church as well to go, to get out from behind the walls of our protection, to get out from behind the comfort of knowing and predictability, and instead step out into the unknown, step out into those places where God says, go. Elijah, one of the great leaders in stories of the Old Testament, was afraid. He was so afraid that he fled because everything was being destroyed. The temple of God, the altar of God was destroyed. The people of God were being killed and scattered. And Elijah, feeling all alone in that and afraid and ill-equipped and unprepared, fled into the mountains and hid in the cave. And while he's hiding in that cave, God comes to Elijah. But in an unusual way. The scripture, in fact, reads this way. That while he was hiding there in that cave, a great and powerful wind tore through the mountains, and it shattered the rocks before the Lord. A wind so strong that it broke the rocks open. But the Lord was not in the wind. And then it says that an earthquake shook the earth, and so much fell apart, and mountains collapsed. But it says that the Lord was not in the earthquake. And then a fire came and consumed everything that was around. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire had come and the earthquake came and the winds blew, it says that a small, gentle whisper. Some interpretations say a still small voice in Elijah or in 1 Kings 19. A gentle whisper came, and Elijah heard it. And he pulled up his cloak over his face because he was afraid, and he stood at the mouth of the cave. And the voice said, "What are you doing, Elijah?" And Elijah said, "Lord, I have been zealous for you, but the Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down the altar and the temple, and the prophets have been put to death by the sword. And I am the only one left, and now they're seeking to kill me too." So God didn't say to Elijah, "Well, then get back in that cave and hide, Elijah. Protect yourself." No. God said to Elijah Elijah, get out of that cave. Go. Go back home. Go to those places where you are afraid, where uncertainty dwells. Go. And he says the same to you and me. Go. I know that you are afraid, but Jesus also said to those same disciples that he sent out 2 by 2 with great uncertainty in their hearts, he said, "Do not be afraid, for I will be with you always." God is always with us. God is that still small voice within us. That is that sense of hope, even in hopeless circumstances. And he invites us to know of that hope.